Hey, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Are there any questions before we start? Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the, the endocrine system. So your learning outcomes are to distinguish between the mode of action of a neurotransmitter and that of a hormone. Distinguish between the endocrine and exocrine glands. Identify the organs and glands of the endocrine system, and compare the actions of peptide and steroid hormones. So the endocrine glands, the organs of the endocrine system, produce chemical signals called hormones, which are involved in the regulation of other organs. The endocrine system works very closely with the nervous system to maintain homeostasis. So the endocrine system is the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the thyroid, the adrenal gland, the parathyroids, the thymus, the pancreas, the gonads, testes, and ovaries. So there's two main types of glands. We have exocrine and endocrine. Exocrine glands secrete their products into ducts. Endocrine glands secrete their products into the bloodstream, which delivers them throughout the body. So only target cells can respond to a hormone. They have receptor proteins for that hormone. The hormone and the receptor protein bind together like a key and a lock. So if we compare the endocrine system and the nervous system, the nervous and endocrine system both use chemical signals. The nervous system uses neurotransmitters and is faster than the endocrine system. The endocrine system takes time to deliver hormones, and it takes time for cells to respond. The endocrine system effects are slower but longer lasting, and both systems use negative feedback mechanisms. So here's a reception of insulin hormone, and here's reception of a neurotransmitter. So hormones are chemical signals. Hormones are a means of communication between cells, between body parts, and even between individuals. Most act at a distance from where they are secreted, and they affect the metabolism of cells that have receptors to bind them. So hormones target specific cells. So local hormones affect neighboring cells. They are not carried elsewhere in the bloodstream. That is prostaglandins or growth factors. Pheromones influence the behavior of other individuals. Animals rely heavily on pheromones to mark territory and attract a mate. Humans also produce pheromones. So hormones have a wide range of effects on target cells. They increase the uptake of a particular substance, such as glucose. They can alter the target cell structure in some way, and they can influence cell metabolism. So peptide hormones are peptides or proteins, glycoproteins, and modified amino acids. So growth hormone is a protein produced and secreted by the anterior pituitary. We have steroid hormones, which are derived from cholesterol. So all have the same complex of 4 carbon rings. So most hormones are peptide hormones, and their actions vary depending on the target cell. When the hormone epinephrine binds to a receptor on a muscle cell, it breaks glycogen down to glucose for ATP production. This occurs in steps. First, cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or CAMP, is formed. This activates a protein kinase enzyme in the cell, which activates another enzyme and so forth. This is called an enzyme cascade. So peptide hormones never enter target cells. Therefore, the hormone is called the first messenger, and the cyclic AMP, which sets the metabolic machinery in motion, is called the secondary messenger. So action of a peptide hormone. Hormone binds to a receptor in the plasma membrane, and binding leads to the activation of an enzyme that changes ATP to cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP activates an enzyme cascade, and many molecules of glycogen are broken down to glucose, which enters the bloodstream. So the action of steroid hormones: only the adrenal cortex, the ovaries, and the testes produce steroid hormones. Thyroid hormones belong to a class of molecules called the amines, which act in a similar way as steroid hormones. Steroid hormones do not bind to plasma membrane receptors. So here's the action of a steroid hormone. So hormone diffuses through plasma membrane because it is lipid soluble. Hormones bind to receptors inside the nucleus. Hormone receptor complex activates gene and synthesis of a specific mRNA follows. mRNA moves to the ribosome and protein synthesis occurs. Okay, so the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So your learning outcomes here are to explain the role of the hypothalamus in the endocrine system, list the hormones produced by the anterior and posterior pituitary glands, and provide a function for each. Summarize the conditions produced by excessive and inadequate levels of growth hormone. So the hypothalamus is a link between the nervous and endocrine systems. It regulates the internal environment via the autonomic nervous system. It helps control body temperature and water salt balance, and also controls the secretions of the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus by a stalk, and the pituitary has two portions, the posterior and anterior pituitary. So neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus produce the hormones antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and oxytocin. These hormones pass into the posterior pituitary where they are stored. Okay, so hormones produced by the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary. So neurosecretory cells produce ADH and oxytocin. These hormones move down axons to axon terminals. And when appropriate, ADH and oxytocin are secreted from axon terminals into the bloodstream. Okay, so the posterior pituitary, certain neurons in the hypothalamus sense the water salt balance of the blood. When blood is too concentrated, ADH is released from the posterior pituitary. ADH causes more water to be reabsorbed into kidney capillaries. As blood becomes dilute, ADH is no longer released, and we have negative feedback, or the effect of the hormone to dilute blood acts to shut down the release of the hormone. So the posterior pituitary, so we have diabetes insipidus, which is the inability to produce ADH, and this produced large amounts of urine, resulting in severe dehydration and loss of important ions, and can be corrected with administering ADH. Okay, so oxytocin causes uterine contractions during childbirth and milk letdown during breastfeeding. The more the uterus contracts, the more nerve signals reach the hypothalamus, causing oxytocin release. As the baby suckles while being breastfed, nerve signals from the breast reach the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus now produces oxytocin, and it is released from the posterior pituitary. So this causes the woman's breast milk to be released. So the release of oxytocin is controlled by positive feedback. The stimulus continues to bring about an effect that it keeps increasing in intensity. Positive feedback terminates due to some external event. So the anterior pituitary, so the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary by producing hypothalamic releasing and hypothalamic inhibiting hormones. So thyroid releasing hormone and thyroid inhibiting hormone. So TRH stimulates, stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone, and TIH inhibits it from secreting thyroid stimulating hormone. So TSH stimulates the thyroid to make thyroid hormones. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol, and gonadotropic hormones like follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone stimulate the gonads, testes, and ovaries to produce gametes and sex hormones. So hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. So neurosecretory cells produce hypothalamic releasing and hypothalamic inhibiting hormones. These hormones are secreted into a portal system. Each type of hypothalamic hormone either stimulates or inhibits production and secretion of an anterior pituitary hormone. The anterior pituitary secretes its hormones into the bloodstream, which delivers them to specific cells, tissues, and glands. Okay, so there is negative feedback mechanisms in the endocrine system. And then the anterior pituitary prolactin, produced only after childbirth, causes the mammary glands to produce milk. Melanocyte stimulating hormone causes skin color changes in other animals, but not humans. So growth hormone, or somatotropic hormone, promotes skeletal and muscular growth and stimulates the rate of protein synthesis. It stimulates the production of insulin-like growth factor by the liver, which also increases growth and development. So overproduction of growth hormone in adults leads to acromegaly. Okay, so check your progress. Explain how the endocrine system and nervous system communicate with one another. List the hormones produced by the posterior pituitary and provide a function for each. List the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary and provide a function for each. So the thyroid and parathyroid glands. So your learning outcomes here are to list the hormones produced by the thyroid and parathyroid glands and provide a function for each. Describe the negative feedback mechanism involved in the maintenance of blood calcium homeostasis, and summarize the diseases and conditions associated with the thyroid and parathyroid glands. So the thyroid gland regulates the metabolic rate of the body and has a role in calcium homeostasis. It's composed of follicles filled with T3, which contains 3 iodine atoms, and T4, which contains 4. If iodine is lacking in the diet, the thyroid cannot produce thyroid hormones. Low levels of thyroid hormones increases the secretion of TSH. Endemic goiter is an enlarged thyroid form increased levels of TSH. So we have an endemic goiter here, congenital hypothyroidism, and an EPS goiter here. So thyroid gland congenital hypothyroidism is underdeveloped thyroid at birth, undersecretion of thyroid hormone. Unless thyroid hormone therapy is begun in the first 2 months of life, intellectual disability results. Myxedema is a hypothyroidism in adults, with the symptoms are lethargy, weight gain, loss of hair, slower pulse, and lowered blood temperature, lowered body temperature. Hyperthyroidism or oversecretion of thyroid hormones. The thyroid is overactive and enlarges, forming a goiter. Eyes protrude from edema and eye socket tissues, where symptoms are hyperactivity, nervousness, and irritability. The treatment is surgical removal or destruction of a portion of the thyroid by radioactive iodine. So calcitonin is secreted by the thyroid gland when blood calcium levels rise. Calcium ions have a role in nervous conduction, muscle contraction, and blood clotting, and it brings about the deposition of calcium into the bones and reduces the activity and number of osteoclasts. So the parathyroid glands, or the parathyroid hormone, PTH, is produced by the parathyroid glands, and this is released in response to low blood calcium levels and activates vitamin D, which promotes calcium reabsorption by the kidneys and stimulates absorption of calcium ions from food. So hypoparathyroidism is insufficient PTH production, causes a dramatic drop in blood calcium, followed by excessive nerve excitability. Increased nerve signals called tetany, continuous muscle contraction. Without treatment, causes seizures, heart failure, and death. So hyperparathyroidism is the oversecretion of PTH and can result in osteoporosis because of continuous calcium release from the bones, and may also cause kidney stones. Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop there for today. Were there any questions before we leave today? Okay, sounds good, guys. I'll catch you later.